This is the $100 billion button, a series on the science of money and well-being. It is produced by Sycamore, an app to learn and practice well-being. Visit us at trysycamore.com. Welcome back to our series on money and well-being. As a reminder, you're standing in front of our $100 billion button. $100 billion, no strings attached. It's almost unfathomable. Almost. At the time of publication, there were 15 people with $100 billion or more on Earth. The 15th richest, Michael Dell, chairman and CEO of Dell Technologies, currently has a net worth of almost exactly $100 billion. This is a real guy out there with the amount of money we're contemplating. Among other properties, he has a 33,000 square foot compound in Austin, Texas, a $100 million penthouse on what is called Billionaire's Row in New York City, a $40 million penthouse in Boston, and a 19,000 square foot retreat in Hawaii. When we envision what it's like to be extraordinarily wealthy, it's not hard to picture a life of pleasure and ease. Work becomes optional. Leisure time is abundant. Stress and worry about making ends meet disappear. Even extravagant material possessions and experiences are merely trivial purchases. Owning a portfolio of luxury homes, as does Michael Dell, becomes standard fare. Retirement is whenever you want it to be. Something like taking a $15,000 vacation across Asia is quite literally a rounding error in their savings account. How could this not be a surefire recipe for greater well-being? Crunching the numbers in research studies is a critical exercise, but it's also important to understand what's actually going on in the lives of the super rich. Thankfully, there has already been work to pull back this curtain. In 2011, a research center out of Boston College published a detailed study of 165 high net worth individuals, 120 of which came from households with a net worth of at least $25 million, and 2 of whom were billionaires. The average net worth across the study was $78 million. The study prompted these individuals to write openly and anonymously about their financial status and overall well-being from home, an effort that produced 500 pages of responses revealing the inner lives of the fabulously wealthy. What did this journaling reveal? For starters, the participants recognized their good fortune and the luxuries it afforded them. They were grateful for their financial standing. However, there was also notable dissatisfaction present in their survey responses. One of the biggest themes across the responses was about how their wealth affected their relationships with friends and acquaintances. Some people actively sought to hide their wealth from others, out of concern that it would distort relationships. Very few people know the level of my wealth, and if they did, in most cases I believe it would change our relationship, wrote one individual. There was a darker side to this too, concern that some people were only sticking around because of their money. Part of this was worry about being exploited financially, but there was also a more interpersonal concern that some relationships around them were inauthentic. One individual wrote, "I start to wonder how many people we know would cut us off if they didn't think they could get something from us." These complications also often translated to their romantic lives, where there were many similar themes around worrying that they were being used by romantic partners. For many, it felt like a balancing act between revealing their wealth too early, thus opening the door for gold diggers, and waiting too long to reveal their financial position at the risk of losing loved ones' trust. In marriages, this played out in the arrangement of prenuptial agreements, which force questions of trust and security. Even between two super-rich individuals, one always has more to gain, or lose. Across the sample, issues stemming from money reportedly caused the failure of many marriages and romantic relationships. For respondents with children, parenting was another big area of note. Raising well-adjusted children around financial excess was a clear challenge. Many did not want their children to lose proper motivation, work ethic, or humility. For those parents who did not themselves grow up rich, these were new dynamics to navigate. Lastly, and perhaps surprisingly, one of the biggest areas of concern was the size of their fortunes. A majority of the individuals surveyed responded that they still did not consider themselves financially secure. For them to feel secure financially would require on average 25% more money than they currently had, which, again, was already nearly $80 million on average. Granted, large portions of these individuals' wealth may be stored in relatively illiquid assets, like property, art, or private equity, as opposed to cash that is readily accessible, but this is objectively a hard viewpoint to understand. Another useful window into the inner lives of the wealthy is through the therapists who work with them, many of whom specialize in working with what are politely called high net worth individuals. These therapists get front row seats into what most troubles their clients. Reports from these therapists cover many of the same themes around difficulty building and trusting relationships. Suspicion of ulterior motives and worry about being used or manipulated are common. Additionally, these therapists report that many hyper-rich individuals that they work with struggle with feelings of purpose, meaning, and ambition, since they already have so much. Underneath all of this can be general feelings of isolation, since there are few people in the world who can really empathize with them. Yet they typically feel guilty complaining, given their vast fortunes. These therapists would also be the first to attest that mental health spares no one, and having money is certainly not a reliable antidote. Indeed, it is not uncommon to hear about the rich and famous entering treatment, either for mental health or substance abuse, or often a combination of both. At the most tragic end of the spectrum, we see suicidality, which has shortened the lives of some incredibly wealthy people in the past 2 decades, including fashion designer Kate Spade, who had a net worth of $200 million, American businessman Thomas H. Lee, who had a net worth of $2 billion, and Adolf Merkel, a German financier worth $9 billion at the time of his death, making him the 98th richest person in the world. All of this is to say, by no measure is money a guaranteed path to well-being. But let's pause. This has been a lot about the plight of extraordinarily rich individuals, most of whom live in the United States, already one of the richest countries on earth. You would be forgiven if your sympathy at this point is muted, or if you were altogether dismissive of their problems. After all, everyone has to deal with the challenges of friendships, romantic relationships, and parenting. Everyone struggles with questions of meaning and purpose. And across populations, mental health is unambiguously worse among poor individuals. The point of this is not to make the rich out to be any more deserving of sympathy, or to make their struggles appear worse than those of people with less money. In fact, this conclusion would be directly counter to the research we covered in the prior episodes, which does reveal that money improves well-being on average. The point is to begin to reveal 2 things. First, why those effects aren't nearly as sizable as we might think. Second, why any one person with extraordinary wealth might still be deeply unhappy, less happy even than someone with far fewer means. Which brings us back to where we left off last episode, which is seeking to explain what we observe in the data. For that, we'll have to dive into our psychology. The first thing we have to explain is why there was such a persistent difference between the effect of money on experienced well-being compared to evaluative well-being, a finding that each type of study reinforced. Why is it that life satisfaction rises reliably with money, whereas our moment-to-moment happiness is more stubborn? For this, we'll look to the theory of hedonic adaptation for answers. The principle of hedonic adaptation is that we have a natural tendency to adapt to the things we have, thereby taking them for granted. The idea is that things that bring about positive or negative feelings only have a temporary effect on our experienced well-being. In other words, our happiness levels reliably return to a relatively stable baseline as time passes. This tendency is omnipresent and nearly unavoidable. Say you buy a new car. The first day you can't stop looking at it in the driveway, all new and shiny. For the first few weeks, you marvel at its smooth steering and crisp sound system. But pretty soon, it just becomes, well, your car. You get used to it, and even start to find flaws. You get annoyed at the weird beeping it makes whenever you take an extra second to put on your seatbelt. It gets its first dent, which was totally not your fault, to be clear. And this happens with everything. That shirt you bought with that insanely cool pattern. That new promotion, complete with a healthy pay raise. That trip to the French Alps. With time, emotions fade. It may still be pleasurable to think back to these things, but in your moment-to-moment life, it doesn't deliver the effect that it once did. This happens with negative things too. That parking ticket you got. That airport security experience from hell. the spat with your neighbor, your first heartbreak. With time, these things don't weigh down your well-being anymore, even if they were conclusively horrible in the moment. In his book, The Pursuit of Happiness, the social psychologist David Myers wrote, "The point cannot be overstated. Every desirable experience, passionate love, a spiritual high, the pleasure of a new possession, the exhilaration of success, is transitory." This may seem like a rather undesirable quality for our emotions, but they make sense from an evolutionary standpoint. The idea of hedonic adaptation is that we need to be able to react to deviations from our current adaptation level, no matter what it is. By automatically habituating to our experiences and circumstances, constant stimuli fade into the background, allowing us to focus on the things that are actively changing. The reason for this is that things that are changing are the most likely to require our energy and focus and improve our chances of survival. If we sat around forever content at a delicious meal, we wouldn't be able to focus on other important things, like needing to find shelter or water, or more food for the next time you get hungry. So for someone with a lot of money, hedonic adaptation makes it difficult for the effects of that money on happiness to persist over time. Your 33,000 square foot mansion becomes just your house, and your Lamborghini becomes just your car. The thrill of your last raise, your big investment payoff, your lottery win, or even your $100 billion button windfall fade over time, returning you to a baseline from which your brain can effectively react and make decisions. Indeed, your experienced well-being has trouble riding the high of the money for very long. In contrast, your evaluative well-being is not subject to the same psychological wiring. When you step back and appraise your life as a whole, it's much less of an automatic process subject to your brain's evolutionary pressures. Instead, it's a more reflective and cognitive consideration that is better at keeping score. If you used to have one house and $5 million in the bank, and now you have 3 houses and $50 million in the bank, it's pretty easy to judge your evaluative well-being as objectively higher. Thus, as people earn more and more money, it's not all that surprising that the gains to experienced well-being are fairly moderate, while evaluative well-being shows stronger gains. The second thing we need to explain is why money does less and less for your well-being the more you accumulate it. If you recall, each study showed that to achieve a given increase in well-being, you would need larger and larger amounts of money. To understand this phenomenon, we'll look at the law of diminishing marginal utility, which is a concept from economics. Marginal utility is the benefit you get from another unit of something. It can be anything: a slice of cake, a t-shirt, a CD of Avril Lavigne's greatest hits. The idea of diminishing marginal utility is that the benefit you get from another unit of something decreases the more of it you already have. If I give you a cup of coffee, you're thrilled. Free caffeine. And the second cup I give you is also pretty good. But by the third cup, it's getting to be more than enough coffee. And by the 35th cup of coffee, you're either just dumping them down the drain or having a really bad time, probably in the hospital. The concept is similar for money. The first $20,000 I give you is literally life-saving. You can afford basic food, water, shelter, and other necessities. When I give you $100,000, it means you can upgrade all these things, plus get a car and take a nice vacation or two. Then $1 million gives you, well, nicer versions of these things: a house, a luxury car, even better vacations. $10 million gives you, well, another house, another car, dinners out every night. By the time you have $100 billion, you really have everything you could possibly need. Do you want 10,000 Lamborghinis? You can if you want. It'll only cost about 4% of your wealth. You can fly privately, but you could do that with way, way less money. You can add another home to the portfolio, but you can't really even spend any time there, given how many houses you already own. It becomes clear that money is subject to the same law of diminishing marginal utility as anything else. The more of it you have, the less an additional unit benefits you. Another way to get the intuition here is to consider what an additional $1,000 is worth to someone making $10,000 versus $10 million. For the person earning $10,000, that $1,000 is worth a lot, 10% of their income. Meanwhile, for the person earning $10 million, it barely registers in their bank account. The richer you get, the more of an increase in money you'll need for it to make a noticeable difference in your life. So when it comes to both experienced and evaluative well-being, it makes sense that it requires ever-increasing amounts of money to provide well-being gains. There are a couple other reasons why more money may not reliably lead to more well-being that are worth considering. The first reason is that money almost always comes along with other things, some of which can be decidedly negative. We touched on this briefly in the last episode, but it is rare for the amount of money you have to increase without any other changes in your life. As the 165 high net worth individuals revealed in their journaling, having large amounts of money leads to new challenges. Trust issues in friendships, meaningless work, exploitative romances. Even things that sound great have consequences. Own a yacht? Great. Well, now you have to fix up that yacht when something inevitably breaks, and store it during the off-season, and figure out what getting a yacht permit in California entails. Own 3 houses? Well, now you have to keep 3 houses up and running. 3 times the paint jobs, mice problems, and dripping faucets. Not to mention going to the DMV 5 times for your 15 cars. Even if you pay someone to do all these things, you still have to manage that person. The second reason is the role of comparisons. We'll discuss this more in the coming episodes, but it is easy to feel like the amount of money you have is never enough. You'll always be able to look around you and find people with even more money, with even nicer things, and this can depress your sense of well-being. Even Michael Dell has 14 people with more than him. 14th place is far, far off the Olympic podium. Effectively, as you earn more money, the goalposts in your mind shift. This effect becomes even more pernicious if you change the people you spend time around. Say that you win the lottery. Suddenly you're the richest person by far in your neighborhood. But the first thing you do with the money is buy a nicer house in a nicer neighborhood. And suddenly you're surrounded by really rich people, many of them richer than you. This effect actually came out in the Boston College study. Those who were less wealthy were distinctly aware of their inferior fortunes. They also felt pressure to spend money at a comparable rate as their richer acquaintances, which added stress to their financial lives. Given all of this, why do misconceptions of the relationship between money and well-being still flood our culture? Why do we still obsess about money to such a large extent? For that and more, stay tuned. Hi there, this is Henry, the founder of Sycamore. At Sycamore, we are out to help people better understand, manage, and practice well-being. If you've enjoyed this series so far, please consider sharing it with a friend, and visit us at trysycamore.com to learn more. Thanks again.